Everybody, welcome back to 18 Outdoors. Today, we're going to learn about what deer eat. So, if y'all have watched anything about land habitat stuff, y'all probably seen a few things that Mr. Alan Summerford done. So, he's getting to be pretty well known in Alabama and I guess the South, and has done several podcasts about habitat and habitat creation for deer, or habitat, maintaining things that you can do to make it better for deer, get the most potential out of your land. So, but since we're hunting public land mainly, I want to talk to him about what the deer eat, and he's going to try to go through from spring all the way through the winter. What the deer eat, when do they go to it, what makes them look for it, and how droughts and stuff affect things, and maybe some different type of protein things, content and stuff. So, if you don't care, Mr. Summerford, tell us about your little project stuff that you've been doing and kind of get a basic idea what.
So basically I started out, I'm a cattle farmer and that has a passion for wildlife, and I had done everything under the sun to try to grow the best deer I could possibly grow, and bow hunt those deer and try to kill those deer. And so I tried every food plot that there was, and you name it, I've planted it, but wasn't really seeing a big difference in all those results. And so what I started learning about was all the native habitat, the native forage that's out there in the woods, in the fields, and how to manage for that. And that kind of led me towards Native Habitat Project with Kyle Laubarger. And I had a bunch of flowers kind of blooming and stuff all over my property. And I called Kyle up one time, and he's always posting about flowers, and said, "Hey man, won't you come look at my flowers?" And of course we walked across the property and stuff. He pointed out a few things, and like, man, this was all like completely new to me, because I had never heard anybody talking about, native plants and stuff. And then turns out I had a whole bunch of good ones on my property that I had no clue about. And the more I dove into it, the more I figured out that how much the deer and the turkey and quail, all of our wildlife need that native habitat. And so started listening to Land and Legacy podcast. And I was like, man, these are the things that I was looking for back a long time ago when I was looking at research or watching hunting videos and everything. And it's all about food plots and stuff like that, and feeding protein and all this kind of stuff. Well, our native forage has so much protein packed in it, calcium packed in it, phosphorus packed in it. That's the three main things that deer need to grow racks. And so I started, kind of following Land and Legacy a little bit. And then turns out they were kind of seeing some of the stuff that I was doing on my properties, and wound up calling me up one day. He's like, "Hey man, we'd like to do a podcast with you." And then after we got done doing the podcast, like, "Hey, do you want a job?" And so now wow. I'm doing consulting for Land and Legacy. So basically going out and seeing what's on the property and addressing and teaching people how to manage for it.
Wow, that's amazing, because I've always kind of wondered about some of that stuff. I've never really researched it much, but I kind of noticed, say Black Warrior area, that mammoth area, years ago they decided they were going to change their thought process, and they closed a bunch of roads off and food plots, stuff like that. And over the next, say, 10 years, things changed. And I got to thinking about some of the stuff like y'all talking about on all them logging roads that went all over that place, everywhere, at all kind of food plots, stuff like that. They were maintaining them logging roads, and they were keeping the edges cut and stuff, and letting things grow up. So when they closed all that off, the trees got big, sun killed all that stuff. How much natural habitat and browse and stuff just went away, because you don't see as much of that stuff now, because all the roads are pretty much gated. And the only ones that really mow or anything, or keep kind of where the sun can get to it and create some of that natural browse, is very limited compared to what it used to be. So,
right.
Some of the other mammoth areas, they've got plenty of cuts and stuff like that where they have more of that stuff, but that place is a little bit limited on some of that stuff compared to what it used to be to me. So,
and diversity is the key. And so diversity of habitat types, diversity of even sunlight getting to the floor, diversity is the key that really unlocks everything for our animals. And really and truly, sunlight getting to the floor, like you was talking about, is the other key. Everything goes through a period that it's going to show up when it has the right conditions. And then that may be a different amount of sunlight. That may be a portion of it can be shade, a portion of it could be sunlight, or some plants have to have full sun to thrive. And so you start seeing, if you have management on the property and you're managing for all of that, having some timber cuts is absolutely great. I mean, who has ever hunted a cut over that didn't see a lot of deer and usually didn't have an encounter with a really good deer? And that's the reason why, is because it went from a closed canopy situation, which most closed canopy situations, you're talking like 50 to 100 pounds of forage per acre per year.
Wow.
50 to 100 pounds.
How much does the deer need?
Well, one average doe needs 2,000 pounds in a year.
Wow.
And so that's really, that's the key, is like, we've got a lot of hardwoods and everybody thinks acorns. And yes, acorns are absolutely great. And we'll kind of talk about some acorns in a little bit when we get to different times of year, but acorns are not what's growing a deer's rack. And it's not really what's feeding deer throughout the summer months when they're growing the rack. And so what really is feeding deer are all of these young, early successional plants, and mainly weeds, mainly things that are broadleaf plants, trees, shrubs, and stuff like that. Grasses do very, very little feed for deer. And really and truly, the only grasses deer really seek out and go after is more like your food plot stuff, like your oats and wheat and stuff like that. But managing for those early successional plants and setting those back and keeping them, in that young state is what's really feeding the deer.
Oh. Well, if you don't care, like, start going through like the spring. So winter's over with, spring starts happening. So what kind of plants and stuff starts going, and what species that those, whether they're fixing to have their fawns go to versus bucks going to, as far as trying to grow their racks or what build their bodies back up.
Yeah. So in the spring, early spring is really not anything that differentiates from bucks and does. They're both kind of seeking out that really, really high quality forage. And typically where you'll see this is where you have some kind of opening. Just say like there are maybe you've done some spring burns, like some February, March time frame you've done burns. Typically those areas are going to green up a little bit faster than areas that had not been burned. Or if you have ample sunlight getting through an area, it's going to green up a little bit faster because the soil's heating up quicker and it's photosynthesizing. And so they're both seeking out the highest quality forage. And a lot of times people don't even realize when they're walking through the woods, this is very, very subtle. Deer don't consume like an entire plant most of the time. Right. Typically you can have, right now I see deer browsing on goldenrod a lot because it's maybe 10 inches tall. It's young and tender, and it's actually green back in January and February, but it's just kind of in its like basal state where it's just a couple of little green leaves, really, really low, flat to the ground. But as soon as the soil temperatures kind of start warming up in the springtime, that plant starts bolting, and it actually comes out and is coming up even while we're still having frost. And so that is extremely young, tender vegetation. It's actually a perennial. And sorry about that. It's actually a perennial, and so it comes back from the roots, and so it's actually bringing nutrients up out of the soil that's way down deep in the soil, mining all those nutrients up, and they're going through there and just taking the tips off of it. Blackberry.
Yeah, pause at that, because that's one thing I've tried to drill over and over about. People thinking deer just go somewhere and just sit there and eat, but they're actually browsers.
Yeah, may be.
So they just pick through. They hardly ever, like you say, stop and just gobble something all the way up. So.
Right. If it's super high quality, you may see a lot more stems in an area, but you just say like the size of this table, there may be 70 goldenrod plants on this table, and you might see 10 browsed at one point in time. Mm-hmm. They're just taking the very top leaf off of the ones, and they have an incredible nose. We all know that. Well, that nose is not just for smelling humans. It's smelling out what is the highest quality forage that it can buy. If it can only hold so much, it's going to want to try to eat the best forage it can possibly eat. And they're moving through these areas. They're not really just standing in one spot grazing for a long time. They're just browsing as they travel through. And they're really feeding pretty quick because, Mother Nature gave them this, awesome ability to go out and just scarf a whole bunch of stuff down and then go back and lay down in their bed later and ruminate. Mm-hmm. And so they'll regurgitate a little bolus, they'll chew it back up and then digest that. And so they can really go out there and feed super quick, fill up quick and go get and lay down really quick so that they're not exposed for a longer period of time. And so they're going out there and they're just picking up those little bitty tiny shoots of these weeds and plants and stuff, and little shoots of trees, but they're going and getting the most highest quality one out of each one. And so when you have a diverse different type of plant life out there, each plant is really good at mining different minerals. Some of them will maybe be a little bit higher in protein, some may be a little bit higher in calcium, some may be a little bit higher in phosphorus, and then all the other micro minerals that, we go and feed minerals out of a bucket, but like our native habitat has every one of those minerals in it. It's all out there. Like they don't need our mineral sites. Our mineral sites just, if you're in, I know you don't do it on public land, but if you're on private land, the mineral sites are just something to kind of attract them to a camera. But the landscape has the minerals out there for them, and they're able to go out there and pick the best ones. And so they're going through there. They're early in the spring. Blackberries actually come out really, really soon. Right as soon as one of the first things that kind of pop out some little bitty green leaves, they'll just kind of eat those little tips of it. The goldenrod is really, really good. Right now I'm seeing a ton of ragweed, pokeweed, a lot of different just cone flowers and stuff like your black-eyed Susan, a lot of like the tick seeds and stuff like that. All those flowering plants that you'll see blooming in the fall, they're actually out there right now, and that's what deer are eating on. But you don't recognize them because they don't have a flower on them.
Wow, beggar lice, some of that stuff too.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, beggar lice is a really, really good one. And so in the springtime, all those things, they're really young and tender. They're in their vegetative state, and plants go through different cycles in their plant life. And early on, they're vegetative, and then they kind of go into reproductive. And when they're reproductive, they're starting to flower. And everybody kind of sees that. Everybody knows when goldenrod's blooming in the fall, everybody's like, oh my goodness, it's like allergies are bad and all this kind of stuff or whatever. You see the flowers, then you think that's goldenrod. Well, that goldenrod's been there ever since January, but it's just been in its vegetative state. But what happens when that flower comes out and that flower starts pollinating and all that, it starts shunting all of those nutrients from the leaves that it's been gathering this whole entire summer and starts putting it into a seed production. Well, at those times, those plants that were really, really good and valuable in the springtime, like in this March, April, even May time frame, those plants are actually senesced out and turning into basically a stick. They're shunting all of those nutrients into seed production, and so the stick that it's up and even the leaves that are on it become very, very low palatability for deer. They're very, very low quality. They're still green, but the deer they kind of go away from those.
So the end of its life cycle, when it goes seed, it's not as much nutrients. So
exactly. Yeah, it's basically it has really high lignin content. It's basically turning into a stick, essentially. The same as a stick that falls from a tree. And so, seeking out these plants while they're in young, tender state is what the deer are really seeking right now.
And greenbrier plays into that too.
Greenbrier is a phenomenal one. It's not quite as high in protein value as some of the other ones are, but it's really, really high deer preference. And the other thing about greenbrier is it's like really putting out a ton of new shoots and stuff this time of year, but I don't see them browsing it quite as much this time of year as I do more later on into the summer, when some of these other things that are like really high quality that are really thriving right now, you get on into the summertime frame and the greenbrier starts getting hit a little bit harder. And even if you have enough greenbrier on the property, you'll have greenbrier that'll last all the way through almost year round.
Right.
It has green leaves. You'll see green leaves on it in January and February where the deer can't reach, or if there's ample food out in the woods that they're just not eating it all up. That's usually a pretty good litmus test. Anytime I go on a property, I'll walk through, and that's pretty much, it grows on just about every soil type, just about every property that I go on in the South, you will see greenbrier on it. And it's one of those where you walk in the woods And if you walk in there and you don't see anything, but you see a bunch of stems about this tall, and they're all nipped down all the way down to the hard, right. stick with thorns on it, those deer are pretty hungry. Mm-hmm. Those deer don't have enough forage in the woods, and they're browsing that because that's all they got left.
Right. That's again being, say, a lot of the management areas we got where they're not doing much cutting. So the bigger woods or the mixture of woods, or that'd be greenbrier scattered. Some places will have a bunch of it where it's getting more sun, I guess, but scattered everywhere pretty much. So that's kind of one of their main staple browses.
Yeah.
Also the muscadines and stuff like that that's coming, especially now, I guess, and that'll carry on through the summer too, as long as you get rain. But rain is a big key through the summer. That stuff will dry out quicker and then kind of lose nutrients, or is it?
Well, so one thing about our native plants is they are really, really good. They've got super deep taproots. A lot of these plants will have 10 and 12 foot down into the soil.
Wow.
They go way down deep. I mean, not all of them go that deep, but there are several of them that go very, very deep into the soil, and so they're extremely drought resistant. They don't really start having a problem until you get way on into summer if you haven't had rain. But we typically always get, even in our drought years, we'll typically get time in May where we get some rain, and we'll always get some rain right there around the 4th of July. We get a lot of rain in July. And so as long as they get some rains here and there periodic, they're okay. They will survive and do okay. But what happens is if it doesn't rain in that latter part of the year, then they kind of start senescing and they start getting stressed and they start getting a little bit harder for the deer to really get everything they need out of them. And if they have a longer break between, the late July time frame to when acorns drop, then they may start stressing a lot then. And so, but still in that early spring time frame, the other thing we don't talk about, a lot of people don't talk about much, is the woody browse from shrubs and trees. So Bankhead does quite a bit of burning. I mean, they burn pretty much every single year, and they burn some pretty big acreages and stuff. And every time a fire rolls through there and it top kills, just say a maple tree or an ash or even oaks, there are a lot of trees that when a fire rolls through there in the dormant season from February, March, even into April, when those fires roll through there, it'll actually kill the top of the tree. And a lot of these trees may be 10, 12, sometimes they'll even kill bigger trees, but especially in that 10 to 12, 15-inch DBH, when it comes through and top kills that tree, the roots will sprout back. And they're pushing a ton of nutrients up. And that same exact tree, if it was a sapling, just say it was a maple tree, it was a young maple tree, it may be 8 feet tall, and it's got leaves going all the way down at, waist high that deer can absolutely reach. Deer won't hardly touch that tree. But if you take that same maple tree that was about 10 to 12-inch DBH, run a fire through there, top kill it, and it sprouts back, deer will eat nearly every single leaf off of that sprout.
Wow, with all the nutrients pulling up.
So it's got a bigger root system, and when it's got that big root system, it's typically feeding that whole entire tree. And when you feed a whole entire tree, all those leaves are the nutrients are dispersed across a whole lot of leaves. So it may be across thousands of leaves. Or if it's a sapling, it may be across 50 leaves. But when you have all those sprouts coming up, it may be across 10 leaves. Well, now all of that nutrients that would have provided for that whole entire tree is now in one little small section of little sprouts that are about 10 or 12 inches long.
That deer can reach.
that are young and tender. Once again, young and tender is key. And that's a really, really high quality forage for the deer.
And that plays into the thinning and the cutovers and stuff like that too. When they're done early, the same thing, stump sprouts.
That's
all
exactly the same thing. And that's, it's typically when I go on a property, what I go to is properties that have closed canopy timber. It's a lot of closed canopy timber, never been burned. Some places may have been clear cut, but it's been, 20 years ago since it was clear cut. And so now we're dealing with, a bunch of trees, really high stem count. It may be thick as far as trees go, but thick in a herbaceous layer on the ground level, there's almost nothing.
Right.
You may see a little bit of greenbrier or a blackberry here or there, but it's really, when you get in those kind of situations, you can see a long way through those trees on the ground, there's really not much but leaf litter. And so when you go in through there and cut some of those trees or run a fire through some of those trees, it actually causes that same stump sprout as if you would take a chainsaw and cut it down. So look for those areas on public ground where they're actually doing timber management or using fire. Within 3 years of a clear cut, that's usually the prime time where everything is putting out the most that it could possibly put out.
Yeah, that's another good question. As soon as they clear cut stuff, like they're going in the spring after hunting season, whatever, as soon as that cuts, some people say, well, it ain't going to be good for 2 years, but that's not true.
Oh, no, it's not true at all.
It's good within a couple of weeks, I think. So
yeah, it can be good. It really depends on what timber was there. If it's pines, it may not be good for a couple of years. But where they cut hardwoods, a lot of really, really big hardwood trees, if you get some like really big oaks that's got a big giant log in it and they're maybe 100 years old or over, then those typically don't stump sprout. Typically when you cut those trees down, those bigger, mature, overstory oaks and different trees, when you cut those down, they're done. They're dead. They don't sprout back again. But it's your younger stuff, like your pulpwood and even up to like cross tie size trees, when you cut those, they typically resprout really, really strong. And so if you've got a lot of that mixed in with those bigger overstory oaks, when they do a clear cut in those areas, you're going to get a lot of that. But what you get, first off, is sunlight to the ground. When they come in there and clear cut, you're immediately getting a response. And depending on what time of year they cut, if they cut, say, late in the summer, well, then none of the stuff really has time to respond with the sunlight. Whereas if they cut January to April, then it actually can be really, really good, because if you think about, we're talking about when we're cutting this stuff down in a habitat manipulation such as fire or something like that, it typically happens in the early spring or something like that. Or if you bush hog a field, or if anything happens, everything kind of comes out at the same time in the spring. But if they come out and they cut just a little bit later in the spring, all of those things are kind of suppressed a little bit, and then they come out a little bit later than what everything else around it did, then that's going to be the youngest and tender stuff. So these plants that were not touched, but they get good sunlight and it's good plants, great composition of stuff, they come out early in the spring and do their thing and they're senesced out and done by August. Whereas if you get a little bit early season clear cut or even a growing season fire, where all that stuff's kind of set back and then it's allowed to kind of thrive and come out at a little bit later period of time, then that right there could be a magnet early season, because the same exact plant that's in this block that's untouched, if it got disturbed a little bit later over here, well, then it's going to senesce about a month or two later than what it did over here. Yeah. And so sometimes you get that really good, lush, tender flush of stuff that's in a younger state that the deer will actually go and crave and go crazy about.
Now, say, like you brought up the pine thicket stuff, like you got some man areas where they got pines, they'll let them grow 10 years, 15, 20, whatever, then they cut them, clear that off. Is there still, like, I guess, I don't know if you could say seed pods or something in the ground, because when they clear all that stuff off, unless they spray it, then there's going to be stuff that comes up out of the ground that's like been hibernating for 10 years, whatever, and then that'll be like good browse until unless they spray it.
Absolutely, yeah. So, as long as they don't go through there and spray a bunch of imazapyr and triclopyr and stuff like that through those pine units, then typically whatever was there previously is just sitting there in its basal state. A lot of these plants can last for years. I mean, some of them, they may last 8 or 10 years, 15, 20 years even in their basal state. They're just barely growing a couple of little leaves, just enough to survive, getting a little bit of sunlight, but they're not ever expressing themselves. But as soon as you come through there and you thin those pines, then those plants actually are like, oh, here we go, the sunlight that we've been waiting on, and then they explode. But then you also have seeds in the seed bank. A lot of these native seeds, they can last 20, 30, 50 years in the seed bank. And so they sit there and they don't even germinate until the conditions are right. So they come through there and thin the pines. Now there's sunlight to the floor, and even if they use fire especially, that actually like promotes some of that germination of those seeds, and then they take off and come out as well. So it may be plants that you never saw while the pine trees were completely shading everything out. But then as soon as they open up that canopy, a lot of these different species start expressing themselves just because they've got sunlight.
That's pretty neat.
So
that's some good information.
And the sunlight's what drives the whole entire, photosynthesis and everything in the plant to be able to provide. So once again, we talk about several different plants that deer like to browse. Well, you can take a plant that's in full sunlight versus the exact same plant, same soil, not far away, but it's not getting quite as much sunlight. The deer will prefer the one in full sunlight because it's actually going through more of the process that it needs to produce a higher quality forage.
That's the kind of stuff that makes deer kind of move, shift. They
Right.
follow that stuff throughout the spring and summer.
No
and
doubt.
So, cool. So, all right, so we're going to carry on into a little bit of the fall stuff, and we've had a good, good wet weather and all that, so we're getting ready for acorns. And then what other things, because you have acorns dropping, you'll have leaves falling. There's certain acorns that deer prefer first, and there's certain leaves that fall too, right? That deer love to eat when they first start falling. Is that right?
Yeah, there's some that I don't see them browsing the leaves a ton, but there are probably some situations, especially in some of these bigger timber units, where there's not as much forage on the landscape. They may browse some of those leaves and stuff as they're falling. But yeah, I mean, what's your favorite oak to hunt?
That depends. For bucks, to me, I prefer a red oak.
Okay, I'm the same way.
But
so I love a red oak, and the reason why I think the red oaks are a little bit more key for where I hunt more bottomland stuff than I do upland stuff, and so red oaks typically thrive a lot better in bottomland areas. But thing is, if there's a hot tree, it don't really matter what the tree is. You can kill bucks on white oaks, you can kill bucks on red oaks, but the red oaks will have a little bit higher tannin level than the white oaks. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily sweeter, less sweet, or anything like that, but the tannin level actually allows those red oaks to stay on the ground longer during rainy periods than what the white oaks can. And so typically, white oaks fall in that early time frame in where I hunt around food plots and ag and stuff like that. There's actually quite a bit of food right there, right about the same time white oaks are falling most of the time. But when red oaks are falling, it's typically later in the season, and they'll even stay good later in the season, so that when everything, after a few good hard frosts and everything, most of the red oaks I hunt start dropping 1st of December, and they do really, really well 1st of December. And sort of correlates with some of the rut we have in North Alabama. My rut's right around November, 1st of December, and so the red oaks actually hit it perfect for hunting the rut and hunting acorns that are where you have a little bit less of a food source of other things. Whilst things are still green, you have the red oaks are kind of like the prized thing that they're seeking after, and I've just had really good luck on it.
Now, can you kind of break it down like there's some varieties of red oak and varieties of white oak to an extent, right? I think there's more varieties of red than there are whites.
Yeah, there's more red than white for sure. So we'll just go bottomland. So bottomland oaks, if you have a white oak, it's going to be a swamp chestnut oak, or you'll have overcup oaks. I'm trying to think if there's anything else bottomland white oak species. That's about it in bottomland. But then you go into the red oaks, you'll have willow oak, water oak. There's a ton of different red oaks. There's like cherry bark, laurel. Water oak and willow oak are both red oaks as well. You'll have Shumard oak, you have Nuttall oak, and so you have so many more varieties of these red oaks. Cherry bark oak, northern red oak, southern red oak, and you'll have some oaks that'll typically like to be a little bit wetter feet, whereas some other oaks, the red oaks, they'll typically like to go a little bit higher up the slopes, or even up on top, where you may get to where you have black oaks or blackjack oak that are also red oak species. They'll be in like your very ridge tops, like if you're in upland type situations, they'll be on super dry, arid south and west facing slopes sometimes. And so you really just kind of have to figure out what type of terrain you're hunting to see which oak you're going to have in those different situations. If it's more wet, you may have more of like the water oak and willow oak type stuff. If it's drier, you may be blackjack and black oak. And then all of the other red oaks are going to be somewhere in between on that slope.
Well, and again on the acorn thing is the nutrient part of it, like you say, just basically building up fat.
Yeah, so
that's why they like them so much.
the acorn, when the deer are kind of going, when they're shifting from that summer time frame on all that, forage and stuff, they're more geared for protein, calcium, and phosphorus. And all of that it's what the does need to raise their babies. It's what the bucks need to grow a rack, and also for body condition. But really and truly, that stuff doesn't condition the body near as well as carbohydrates and fat. And the main thing that's found in acorns is the carbohydrates and fat. They're not really high in protein, but they're really that's how the deer really bulk up in the fall. When they feed hard on those acorns, they're going out there and they're trying to get fat because they're wanting to consume as much of that as they possibly can to go into winter at a really good body weight, because they're fixing to go through the rut, fixing to go through some cold stages, they're fixing to go through some stages where there's very little high quality food. And so they're really trying to bulk up, just get as fat as they possibly can, because the fatter they are, the healthier they are going into the winter, the better they'll sustain their weight coming out of the winter.
So after that part, later on in the winter, and then maybe we can say like last year we had drought that pretty much knocked out all that stuff. We didn't have any acorns. So in a woods type situation, what are the deer kind of browsing on or kind of picking on to survive or just basically live, because they don't have the mass crops to help them boost up? Because everybody's about learned by the last 5 years is that we've had a couple bad deals where we didn't have any acorns, and the sign was not there like it usually do, because they don't have the, extra energy or extra carbs, whatever.
That's exactly
where they go out and do all that. So what would basically keep a deer alive during these winters like this that we had last year, as far as that kind of plants or whatever?
So basically, once all the green stuff, you get a couple of frosts, it's gone. Acorns come, then eventually they're gone. Then you get into that winter time frame where now it's all woody browse. It's almost 90 to 100% woody browse, unless there are food plots. This is like the weakness in native habitat, is that winter time frame. That's why supplemental food plots, if you're on private ground, is really essential. This is when they really shine. This is what really holds deer and helps deer make it through the winter time. The wheat, oats, clover, and all that kind of brassicas, even all that kind of stuff really gives the deer a really high quality food source that the native habitat does not do. But even in ag country or timber country, does not matter, a deer still is eating woody browse. Woody browse is like little, in the wintertime, once you get into December, 1st of January, all of the little buds on trees, they kind of start poking out. There'll be a little bitty tiny little tip of every tree, every bush, even some of the like your shrubby type stuff. All those little tips are what deer are going to start feeding on that time of year. And that doesn't have very much protein value, but it actually helps them to warm up, because it takes their body a little bit more energy to break all that kind of stuff down. So it actually helps them heat up and warm up as they're eating that kind of forage. And that's what gets them through until the green up happens. And so, those are things that, that's why a clear cut or even a fire unit is so important to deer at that time, because you've got a lot of new sprouts that are at a deer's level. And so if you've got more of that, the best thing is like an old field area where it's like 3,000 pounds of forage per acre throughout, and it's going to have a mixture of weeds and shrubs and tree tips and everything, and you're keeping all of that maintained every 3 years and with fire or disturbance. And so that's going to be where a lot of deer are going to start seeking out, is those areas like that. Thicker areas where you've got a lot of young regeneration of trees, that's typically where they're going to hold up in those areas. And so they're not only doing that for the cover, that's what they're feeding on.
Right. Well, some of the cutovers, say 2 to 6, 7 years old, it's got enough growth that some of that stuff gets protected, say honeysuckle lower and some other browse that's protected through the winter, so they'll pick on that stuff too, or move to that part too.
That's exactly right.
So what about, there's times, and we've talked about this with some other folks over the years, I've seen deer eat pine needles. I've seen them eat cedar.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen them eat mountain laurel. How good of that? I mean, when it comes to when they start eating that stuff, there's a lot of stuff that's not there that they need that's backup reserve stuff or emergency food.
That's just survival food. They're just trying to their rumen has to keep working, because if they don't put anything in their rumen, and a lot of that bacteria that's actually digesting the nutrients out of these plants, is they're not actually digesting the plants. The bacteria in their stomach is what digests the plants, and they absorb the nutrients from those bacteria and stuff. And so, like, they have to continue to feed on that to keep that gut healthy, keep that gut alive. And even if it's not high quality, it has some value, but it's just they're not gaining weight off of it, and they're really just trying to survive. Even privet. I hear people talk about privet all the time, and deer absolutely eat privet. But it's one of those foods that's just really, really low quality. And I had a farm, when I first bought the farm up in Tennessee, there was a lot of privet down in this little creek drainage and everything. And the first couple of years, I would find a lot of dead deer down in that drainage. And there would also be, just a complete browse line. You could just see the privet. It was pretty tall. Some of it was probably, 12, 15 feet tall. And there was a perfect line. Everywhere a deer could reach upon its back legs, it was eating that privet.
Wow.
And all the timber, was big, open timber. A lot of acorns out there, but then once the acorns were gone, it was pretty much it. Really didn't have a great food plot program in place yet. And the deer were really starving to death. There's a really high deer density, and they were really starving to death. But then after a few years of managing the timber, burning, managing the fields, getting a really good food plot program, they don't even hardly touch the privet anymore. And I've killed most of it out now. Yeah. But like, that's the thing is, like, they're going to find something to eat. Now, they may not be doing really well on that. They're just getting through. And the difference between a deer, Mississippi State did a ton of research where they took deer from the 3 different areas in Mississippi, from the Delta and the lowest hills and then the coastal plain. And once they fed those deer for 2 years the same exact diet, the coastal plain deer were just as big as the Delta deer. And so the genetics were there to grow their racks, but the problem is deer are not going to outfeed themselves, because they have to have things in place, because we have droughts. Some years we have years of plenty, some years we have famine. And so if a deer just got to the biggest it could possibly be because we had one good year, well, then the next year, if we had a drought, or if it's a tough year with no acorns and stuff like that, then they wouldn't be able to maintain that weight and survive. And so what they do is they have receptors that turn on when the habitat gets really, really good in an area, and it sustains for more than just one season. If it sustains over 3 to 5 years, then they start turning on receptors to actually grow bigger and get bigger. And so they're able to start expressing more of their genetic potential, because they're not worried about food being gone in a wintertime. They're not worried about 1 year of drought hurting them. There's enough food out there, and the carrying capacity is at the right level to where they actually reach their potential, because when they're in their survival time frame, they've actually got pretty good food to eat. And so you may be looking at things on your public ground. If there's not any management being done on that public ground, if there's areas, granted there are some big deer in areas where there's zero work done, but there's typically really low deer densities. And then you have some areas that have really high deer densities, a lot of work being done. You may not have quite as big a deer sometimes, because there's just so many mouths to feed. But if you find some kind of happy medium in between, it's usually pretty good.
There's only a certain amount of prime food, regardless.
That's right.
So if you get a bunch of deer eating, then it's going to be hurting others.
And so that's where I'm doing a lot of management on my properties, where I'm trying to ramp up as much food as I can possibly provide for the deer, and then I'm hammering the does. I'm absolutely wiping the does out. I try to keep that carrying capacity super low, so there's always ample food, that they'll actually even browse out some of the higher quality species. Deer, like strawberry bush, is one that I see on very few properties, and usually the properties that I see it on, it's either in a place that deer can't get to, or it's in a place where there's a really low deer density. But it's the ice cream of all plants. It's one of their favorite plants. It's not necessarily the highest in protein, but for whatever reason, they absolutely love that plant. It actually stays green up in the wintertime some too, but they will browse every stick of it. and you usually never see it get very tall because they just browse it to death. And if you have a really high deer density and a lot of deer eating that, they'll eventually browse that thing to where every time it tries to put a leaf out, it gets browsed. Eventually, it runs out of root reserve and it just dies. So they can actually change and transform the habitat that's on the property.
That's all. That's unique on some of that stuff. Like we go to New Brunswick, Canada, and talk to some of them people, and their deer up there, according to what the guy was telling me, and I've been up there deer hunting one time, and I only seen 2 bucks, I think, in 10 days or something. But anyway, he said the way their environment is in the winters and all that, them deer won't, like at 2 years old, their rack might be like that. They're not. They're going to grow their body for 3 years or so before they even any kind of rack start popping up. Their bigger racks is 6 to 8 years old, I guess, which is unique compared to down here. We got, at 4 years old most of the time, they got a decent amount of food. They're booming pretty dang good. But that's all cool about how the food and how the different deer and their habitat, how all that's in trailers for them to get that size racks and stuff. So that's
and they have to get that big up there to be able to make it through the winter. I mean, body size is everything up there. The bigger their rumen is, the more they can hold, the warmer they can stay. And so
it takes them, I guess, 3 years to top out, and then they start putting food.
And and over time, nature has selected for the ones that survive, and over time, like that's the genetic that has done the best in that area, and so like that's where, years and years and years and years of selection has created that. Whereas, when they brought deer from up north down here, they don't necessarily have to get to that same size to survive. And that's going on a whole nother tangent, a whole nother topic. But like the deer, when they bring them to a new location, they may not exhibit the exact same things that they did where they came from.
Well, so the biggest points I'm getting out of this, for your best food stuff, the best place to hunt, diversity, places where they burn, cuts, all that, and I guess a little bit of genetic stuff to build the bigger racks, depending on what you want to hunt. So kind of looking at these areas and then kind of paying attention to how they develop through the season. So what they're going to move to, So the public land part of that is different. So versus say you've got prime areas, your land, you've been managing it for several years. So is the state, they're limited, I guess, on funds. Where do you think prefer in the state is the better out of what travels you've done as far as management parts on the public land stuff? I've got a pretty good answer for me, and a lot of people probably ain't going to know anything about it.
Well, I've only seen 2 public lands, and I've only ever hunted one, and so I don't have the greatest intel on that. But I would, from what I know, I would say that Bankhead's got pretty good managed, because just driving down the road through Bankhead, I see a lot of early successional stuff. I'm not the one to ask on that. So
they have changed that over the last, say, 10 years as far as some of the stuff they're doing. But some of the, I've only seen parts of some of the SOA stuff that they've got now. They've worked on them pretty good because they're located from historical days, the Black Belt region, the deer region of Alabama. So some of that's something to think about. So when you're trying to plan your public land and stuff for Alabama, them cuts and all that, remember that stuff is prime. Some of it's hard to hunt because a lot of people are not used to hunting that. So be able to adjust and then put in from SOA for some of that, because they're micromanaged a little more than the bigger managed areas, because they're smaller areas and they can, they got more equipment to do that stuff. So
one thing I like to focus on for public land is, especially in like swampy type land where they're not doing any management, I look for beavers. Beavers are some of the best management tool that you could possibly have for your public lands where there's no management happening, because they're actually going out there and creating all those stump sprouts. Yeah. They're putting daylight to the floor. They're actually flooding areas, and then when those flooded areas, they'll go and actually start killing trees, and those trees die out. And eventually, sometimes those beavers just decide to go up and leave and go somewhere else. Maybe they've eaten everything that they want to eat there, and they go to another place. That dam gets washed out. The waters kind of start receding. Even just the management of the water levels. Yeah. Those are they're kind of resetting things, almost like what fire is doing, the water being up over it all winter long, even staying out into the spring sometimes. And then when those waters start receding and then sunlight starts hitting that dirt again, you start getting that flush of new growth. And so look for those areas. That's something that I really key in on. I try to find those stump sprouts. I mean, that beavers are going and creating. The deer are coming right behind them and feeding on those as well. And I mean, deer don't mind water whatsoever. In fact, most of the time when I hunt, if you're not in the water or touching the water, you're probably not in the game. And so they like to swim. But they are going through there behind the beavers because there's a lot of sunlight hitting the floor. There's a lot of stump sprouts, a lot of woody browse in those units and in those areas. And so that's something that I like to key in.
Yeah. And some of the old school people, or even the newer ones, just remember, you're hearing all kind of complaints about the burning and the cutting and all that, but deer do not do well in old growth forest.
Yeah.
That's just simple. So the cuts and the burning and the thinning and all that creates everything we need for us hunters, to be able to do what we're going to do.
Yeah. So another thing I would say about burning too is I do see some burns that are not beneficial. When they burn through in a dormant season in a complete closed canopy situation, it may actually get rid of a lot of that woody browse. It may get rid of some of those plants that we were talking about with a lot of high protein and all that kind of stuff, because if there's sunlight not hitting the floor and you roll a fire through closed canopy timber, it actually kind of creates a desert. A lot of those plants that were just barely hanging on, waiting for that sunlight to come through, the fire can roll through and top kill those out, and then it's not enough sunlight for it to kind of regenerate. Then it can kind of create a desert in that area. So look for areas with open canopy and fire. That's typically going to be a better burn than just burning through woods. So keep that in mind when you're looking at it.
A thinning process along with that, or areas that's, I guess.
30% canopy opening will typically grow close to 500 pounds of forage per acre versus a closed canopy situation that is 50 to 100 pounds of forage per acre. So just that much opening makes a huge difference. And if you have an opening that's up to 40 and 50% canopy opening, that's usually a really, really high quality food.
What about the pine beetle situation?
Well, that's probably going to be really good, honestly.
That's going to help the deer big time, right?
Once they get some of that stuff burned through, because I mean, it's going to be so bad and so thick, like it's going to drop so many trees down on top of each other. They're going to be hard for them to get in there and use it. But sunlight's going to get in there, and I hope they bring fire back repeatedly for a couple of years, and those areas should be prime.
Yeah.
So
that's going to be something interesting to see. But yeah.
And still, the edges of those are going to be really good because there's going to be a lot of structure. But when all those pines start dying, you're going to have an edge where they didn't die, and so you don't have quite as much structure through there. But they've got enough structure they can move through, and sunlight gets through. That's usually going to be really good. They're creatures of edge anyway, and that's why they've got some sunlight and some cover and a lot of good high quality forage.
Man, it's been a good conversation. I appreciate it, man. Brother,
yes, sir. Thank you for having me.
I hope y'all got something out of this. If not, gripe on me. So I tried to lay it out. But anyway, we have younger hunters and newer hunters that kind of try to learn some of this stuff about what deer eat, what to look for. So browse, one of the key things, the buzz, pay attention, smaller details about what they're eating, how they nip again, because most of the time they walk through nipping. You can see them nips pretty good if you know what to look for.
It's very subtle, but once you start seeing it and looking for it, it'll stick out like a sore thumb.
So, appreciate y'all watching. If you haven't liked, please like and subscribe. Hey, it's the time of the year. Everything's getting ready. We're trying to get ready to get them flat, so it ain't going to be long. It's going to be winter.
That's right.
That's when you get older like me. It's going by so fast. Anyway, appreciate y'all. We'll see y'all. Hey everybody, thank y'all for watching the videos. Well, again, we appreciate y'all's support. If you haven't liked, please like and subscribe. And don't care if you haven't got one of our books, check out Amazon and get a book. Also, we got a link on there where you can, on our YouTube channel, where you can go on. We got a little store set up. Like if you're interested in any kind of merchandise, shirts and stuff, you can check that out. And we really appreciate anything like that. So, again, we appreciate y'all's support. Keep watching. We're going to keep trying to share the outdoors and how we do some things and try to help everybody that we can enjoy the outdoors. And, we do this for just basically because of the environment and the community that's involved and built around hunting. So Again, we appreciate y'all. Like, share, and we'll see y'all again.